We're making our way through John here at the end of summer, and we are in John chapter 4. So we hope you grab your Bible and go there as we spend a little time today talking about this chapter. One of my more favorite chapters in the Gospel of John, mainly because of the story I think we most often associate with this chapter, and that is the Samaritan woman.
Right, it's one of the most familiar stories in this gospel.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to ignore the chapter division and remember that he's just dealt with Nicodemus. That's
Right.
chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a reminder, when we get into chapter 4 and he's traveling from Judea to Galilee, and at a well in Samaria, he encounters this woman. The woman here could not be more different than Nicodemus, because Nicodemus is a powerful man, a very religious man.
Well-connected.
Yeah, all the, let's say it this way, he's got the pedigree, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the
And
respectability.
This woman is exactly the opposite.
Yeah, and apparently an outcast even among Samaritans, which is saying something.
Yeah, that's perhaps why she's coming to the well when she is,
Correct.
and others
Yeah.
aren't around.
No, that's right.
Because she's avoiding the disapproving looks of the crowd.
Yeah, no, she's an outcast even among Samaritans, so this is the lowest of the low.
Right. So that theme we periodically bring up of who's in and who's out, and the surprising nature of that in the gospel. This is a good example of that, because you think a guy like Nicodemus, the leader, he's got it all together. He's got his ticket punched to heaven, and yet he struggles with what Jesus says. And by contrast, you have this woman who in every way looks like she is outside. She is not fit because she just doesn't have the pedigree. Her life has been really, really rough. And yet she is the one who is the believer by the end of the story.
And then telling her fellow citizens there of the city that we need to talk to this guy. You need to listen to this guy.
So talk a little about the story and its place in the gospel. Why this? Why here? What are you thinking?
Oh, I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to what you just said and what we just set up here, which is pull the chapter breaks out. You have stories that are meant to comment and contrast on each other. So you have this the high social status, humanly speaking, versus the lowest of the low social status, man versus woman. And so different little twists there. But then also the opportunity to talk about. Jesus talks to Nicodemus about being born again, being born of the water spirit. Here, Jesus introduces a new metaphor, living water. And,
Right.
And that's the thing is, and actually it's a little bit of a word play, and back in the Semitic languages, like Jesus would have been speaking, the woman would have been speaking, Hebrew, Aramaic, they're actually vocabulary poor languages. They work more like by analogy. So the word play or the concept play that Jesus is working off is, and we don't think about this much anymore because we have indoor plumbing. We're not really thinking about where we get our water from. And water is more important than food in the ancient world. It's harder to come by in some ways than food. Water truly is the resource. And so we don't think about this much anymore because we just have indoor plumbing and treated water. But in the ancient world, wells were a place of getting water. But if you've ever looked at a real well and you look down the well, you look at the water at the bottom of a well, it's not always the nicest looking stuff. And so, you had well water, you had cisterns, which are basically, ancient version of rain barrels.
Right.
They carve them out of rock and dig channels, like so when the rain would come and pool the water and collect it, kind of like reservoirs. But again, that standing water, whether it's well or cistern, standing water tends to get stagnant, tends to grow some stuff, it's real nice. Living water, Jesus is punting off the idea how in Semitic language, one of the ways you talked about flowing water, like a river or a stream was, they used the word for life because life is movement. And so flowing water, moving water was living water in Semitic languages. And so Jesus is punting off of, the really good water is not well water or cistern water. The really good water is the real fresh water, the river, the stream. But obviously it goes beyond that. He's not just saying, I'll give you a better kind of water, literally. He's saying, I'll give you the water that literally leads to life. And so kind of a pun off where you get your water to where you really get your water.
Right. And that's interesting because that's really a parallel to the discussion with Nicodemus, isn't it? Because his struggle was with the new birth and how can that be?
Correct.
And trying to differentiate between the physical and the
Correct.
spiritual. And so she's wrestling with the same thing. You talk about literal water. You don't have anything to draw with. How are you going to get that?
Right.
And so he's trying to stretch her thinking a little bit to get her to see the spiritual
Right.
lesson he's trying to teach her.
No, that's right. And even before this chapter's over, we'll have another aspect of how Jesus is showing that in one sense, the even the necessities, the physical necessities of this life, being born or food or water are really ultimately, he can turn them into metaphors, analogies for what's really spiritually necessary. Spiritually, you must be born again, not just a physical birth, which is all Nicodemus can think of. Jesus coming on punting off of what's really good water. It's not just the fresh flowing water of a stream. It's me, my words. It's all of that. And then when his disciples come here in another paragraph and say, have you already eaten? What about food? Well, Jesus, no, my actual food, what really keeps you alive is to do the will of God. That's my food, to do the will of him who sent me. And so, Jesus is throughout these early chapters of John taking these, things that we think are essentials of life. You have to be born, you have to drink, you have to eat, and saying none of this is what real capital L life really is. It's about being born of water and spirit. It's about, drinking living water. It's about eating real food, the will of God.
It is a little bit comforting to see all of them sort of struggle.
Oh, yeah.
As they're trying to move from, they just don't get it yet. They're really not processing what the kingdom is really all about.
That's right.
And so they're stumbling along the way, which is kind of reassuring to me and you, because we stumble along the way sometimes too, trying to figure out what it is that God wants us to see. I do want just a little diversion with the Samaritan woman, because I think there's such an important evangelistic lesson in her story. If we were living back in that time, trying to talk to people about the gospel, which one of these two would we have looked at and said, this is a good prospect?
Yeah.
This is the person.
This is worth my time and effort.
Correct. Exactly. And so I think there is a tendency to overlook the people who may in the end be the most receptive. And I think that even in the exposing of her life, which is really what helps things kind of begin to click for her, I think we see on her end some recognition that she's in a mess and she really does need to get out.
Right.
And I think a lot of people who are in messes realize that. They just don't know the way out, and they need for someone to help them. And so I think it's important. Sometimes the most desperate and the people who need it the most are the people that we just say, they're in a mess, I don't think they'd be interested.
Right. Yeah, and just write them off. And whereas this is the woman who literally, by the time you get to verses 25 and 26, is, she's wondering about who the Messiah is and who the Christ is. And Jesus is saying, I who speak to you am he. And then she's basically, kind of repping Jesus to the folks in the city on the basis of that. Unlike Nicodemus, who comes by night, and and granted, Nicodemus will, seem to make some changes by the end of the book, or but
we hope so.
But this woman, here she is. Initially,
her response is immediate.
Immediate.
Yeah.
And there's one other thing, before we leave her story behind that is again some of the more famous, at least for us, famous verses of John. They also get into discussion about the nature of worship and where.
Yes.
And we get that famous line about worshiping in spirit and truth that Jesus reminds her of. It's not about where. She tries to draw Jesus in, and I don't think she was like the Pharisees testing him, trying him, but just, okay, you seem to be a rabbi, you seem to be somebody who knows what he's talking about, and you're Jewish, so we have this great debate between Jews and Samaritans over which mountain is the one. The Jews say obviously Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and Samaritans say it's a different mountain. And what do you say? And Jesus says, I think it's about to be irrelevant.
Right.
What I think is the hour is coming that and now is here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. It's not about where you are, but who you are and how you do it. That's about to come to pass. And so again, these shifts that he's offering her.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, because you almost have in both of these stories a key phrase that we connect to the story.
Right.
In the case of Nicodemus, it is, you must be born of water and the Spirit, or you can't enter the kingdom of God, right?
Right.
And in this story, it is true worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. There's kind of a key phrase that registers in our mind about that. We probably should say just a word about the Samaritans, because in a sense, they're kind of that next level out from the Jew, right? You had the Jewish audience, and now Jesus' audience is expanding beyond the Jewish audience. And I do think we
Yeah.
have a lot during the life of Jesus, like with Matthew, chapter 2, you have the Magi showing up on the scene.
Yeah.
So you have these kind of non-Jewish elements beginning to factor into the story and falling into his sphere of influence.
Well, and one of the things that the Gospels consistently do, not just John, but the other Gospels as well, is they give us stories of Gentiles having greater faith, more immediate faith than the Jews do. Stereotypically and
Right.
collectively. That's part of the power. Whether it's the Magi coming with gifts that literally fulfill a prophecy and allusion in Isaiah. That our Bibles don't often link that, but it's actually riffing off a passage in Isaiah where you have basically the Magi represent the nations coming to worship the true
Right.
King. And so that's its own form of confession, actually, and I think it's what Matthew's trying to allude to. If you know Isaiah, if you know the prophets, the Syrophoenician woman in the Synoptics. To here, you've got the Samaritan woman. Who they always demonstrate quick faith, immediate faith, substantive faith, as kind of almost like a rebuttal or a distinction to the folks who had the prophecies, who were the children of Abraham, who should have been all in on the Christ showing up, and instead either doubt, don't get it, disagree vehemently, deny, blame it, credit Satan with what he's
Right.
doing, what have you. It is interesting that the Gospels consistently from Matthew to John show these outsiders as the ones who get it first, not such Nicodemus. The Jewish people in general don't. Jesus' own people, like John's Gospel starts that way. He came to his own, and his own didn't receive him.
Yeah.
So but the Samaritans, part of why she's more open is the Samaritans, they were half breeds. They had some Jewish elements in them, but obviously, they looked down at the Jews looked down at
Right.
them. But they were. They had a form of the Old Testament Bible. They didn't recognize the canon quite like we do, and some other things, and they had some changes they had made to it. But that's why they still tried to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They on a mountain, and were open to the coming of a Messiah and some things like that. They had some overlap in what they religiously believed, and kind of a riff off of Judaism. And so, so she's looking for it too. She's looking for the coming one too. Very different twist.
So at the end of this chapter,
Yeah.
this is
Second sign.
Yeah,
Second
well,
sign
this
of
is
John's
interesting
Gospel.
because chapter 2, you have the first sign,
Right.
the turning of the water to wine, right?
Right.
And then you have 2 episodes, Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman,
Right.
and then you end with a sign. It's almost like the signs are bookending a section there a little bit,
A
almost.
little bit.
And in this case, there's the healing of this royal official's son. What do we make of him? Who's this guy? He's from Capernaum.
Yeah, which we know from the Synoptics kind of becomes one of the areas that Jesus works a lot in and lives in for a while. And so verse 48, Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." And so, "Sir, come before my child dies. Go, your son will live." And then you get to the end of the story. Verse 53, the father knew that was the hour when Jesus said to him, "Your son will live." That very, and it's a 7th hour, little details like that. 7th hour, very symbolic number. And so the second sign indicating again, believing in the signs, believing in Jesus. But if the first sign, water to wine at a wedding, was kind of a down payment of the Messianic banquet, Jesus has come to bring joy.
Okay, pause there a second.
Yeah.
Before we leave that, just quickly, the Messianic banquet is this Old Testament figure.
So the Old Testament, going all the way back to even like Sinai, Exodus chapter 24, when God first makes a covenant with his people.
Yes, and there's the gathering.
And then God invites onto the mountain that nobody was supposed to come on. Has Moses, 70 elders come onto the mountain, and they eat and drink before God. And they don't bring food. The text seems to imply God hosted the feast on his mountain. And so you start with this idea of God hosting feasts on his mountain for his people. Perhaps maybe there's some other places, but I like Isaiah 25 as a one-stop shopping. Clearly end times kind of stuff going on there in Isaiah, because death will be done away with, the veil. Death will be done away with once and for all, and God will host on His mountain a feast. So this idea of in the days of the Messiah and His fullness, the end of all things. God, part of what, will make eternity is, a great feast of God. That becomes like in Revelation in the marriage feast of the Lamb. So, weddings were times of celebration. Weddings were times of consummation after anticipation. Of course, literally God intends, marriage to be a metaphor of Christ and the church. So, so all this hanging over. So we call it the messianic banquet idea. That in the consummation of the messianic work at the end of time, it's going to be like a great banquet, even like a wedding feast.
And so we open with a wedding feast in John 2.
And Jesus providing the wine, a symbol of abundance, of joy, and it doesn't run out. When you think you've run out, you have it if Jesus is with you. And
in fact, you have the best.
And you have the best. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
The best is what was provided by the Messiah.
So the first sign is, and that's part of why, again, people get kind of, when Jesus says, Mary says, do something about it back in John 2, and he says, my hour is not yet. It's not really the time for the messianic banquet yet he'll still do a little sign there. So you have, the very first sign in John's gospel is showing what Jesus is ultimately going to bring for for those who believe in him, for those who follow him. So this sign, part of that getting to that is life from death. And again, in this case, just the power of Jesus to simply speak a word. Go, your son will live. Mm-hmm. Doesn't even have to go, doesn't have to touch, no rituals, no fancy stuff, just a word. Yep. And then again, the story goes on to indicate by the time he gets home, 7th hour, he realizes that from the moment Jesus spoke that word. Why does John want us to know that? The power of Jesus. Yeah. Doesn't have to come and do anything like a prophet, just literally speaks the word, and his son lives. The illness, the risk of death is gone. And so, we get that next sign of the power of Jesus, of what Jesus can do for you. You could be on the point of death, and if you're with Jesus and you have faith in Jesus and you're going to follow Jesus, life. He speaks a word and you live.
I wanted, before we're done, to return back to the Samaritan woman and the topic of evangelism, because I think there's an opportunity here to for parents to have a conversation with their kids about evangelism. You guys do realize that we had another young person baptized this last week who the gospel was shared with her by one of the young people in our church family. And that brings, if my count is correct, to 5 teenagers that we have in our church family who were helped to Christ by young people. And so I don't think we appreciate that very often, how young people are at a prime time of life to be talking to people about Jesus and can really make a difference. In many church families I've been part of, young people were among the best soul winners in the congregation. And so don't pass an opportunity to talk a little bit about Jesus' effort to reach this woman, even in the face of some pretty stiff resistance from her, to teach kids a lesson about, even in the face of a hostile world, of talking to their friends or people out there who are interested. And we think it's a great opportunity for you to emphasize that lesson with your kids and to encourage them in this work. So think about that as you work through John 4 this week.